Now, settle in close to that fire, friend, and let me tell you a story that'll make your blood run hot and cold in the same breath. This here's a tale about justice served raw, about a young man who some called a killer and others called a hero, and about a day when the scales of right and wrong got balanced in a way that still sends shivers down the spines of old-timers who claim they were there to see it. The year was 1878, and the territory of New Mexico was a place where a man's character was measured not by the gold in his pocket or the prayers on his lips, but by how fast he could draw iron and whether he had the stones to pull the trigger when the moment came calling. It was a hard land that bred hard men, and none harder than a blue-eyed kid with sandy hair who went by the name Billy Bonney, though most folks knew him by another name entirely, Billy the Kid. Now, before you start thinking this is just another yarn about gunfights and glory, let me set the record straight. This ain't no dime novel romance about noble outlaws and dastardly villains. This is about something deeper, something that cuts to the bone of what it means to be a man when the world's gone sideways and the law's as crooked as a dog's hind leg. The trouble started, as most trouble does, with a woman. Her name was Maria Elena Vasquez, and she was as beautiful as a desert sunrise, and twice as dangerous to a man's peace of mind. She had the kind of eyes that could melt a heart, or freeze it solid, depending on her mood, and skin the color of honey touched by moonlight. She ran a small cantina on the outskirts of Lincoln County, serving up whiskey that could strip paint and frijoles, that could make a dead man sit up and ask for seconds. But Maria Elena was more than just a pretty face serving drinks to dusty cowboys. She was smart, book smart and street smart both, and she had the kind of backbone that most men would envy. She could handle a Winchester rifle like she was born with it in her hands, and she wasn't afraid to use it when the situation called for such measures. The problem was Sheriff Jebediah Murdoch. Now, Murdoch was what you might call a man of contradictions, if you were feeling generous. If you weren't feeling generous, and most folks who knew him weren't, you'd call him a yellow-bellied, snake-mean son of a bitch who wore a badge like it gave him the right to lord over anyone he deemed beneath his notice. And in Murdoch's twisted view of the world, that included anyone who wasn't white as fresh snow and twice as pure. Murdoch stood 6'4" in his boots, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and hands the size of dinner plates. He had pale gray eyes that never seemed to blink, and a mustache that drooped down past his chin like he was trying to hide the cruel set of his mouth. But you couldn't hide the meanness that radiated off him like heat from a forge. It was there in the way he walked, like he owned every inch of ground his boots touched. It was there in the way he looked at people, like he was calculating their worth and finding them wanting. And it was there, most especially, in the way he looked at Maria Elena. The first time Murdoch laid eyes on her was a Tuesday evening in late September. The sun was hanging low and red over the mountains, painting the world in shades of blood and gold, when the sheriff came riding into town with 3 of his deputies trailing behind him like faithful hounds. They'd been chasing down a horse thief, at least that's what they claimed, and they were thirsty for something stronger than water. Murdoch pushed through the doors of Maria Elena's cantina like he owned the place, his spurs ringing against the wooden floor with each step. The conversation died like someone had thrown a blanket over it, and every man in the place suddenly found something fascinating to stare at in the bottom of his glass. "Well, well," Murdoch drawled, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from a badge and a gun. "Looks like we got ourselves a new establishment here in Lincoln County." Maria Elena looked up from behind the bar where she'd been wiping down glasses, and for just a moment, something flickered in her dark eyes. Fear? Defiance? It was hard to say, but she straightened her spine and met Murdoch's gaze without flinching. "Sheriff," she said, her accent lending a musical quality to the word. "What can I do for you?" "That's what I like to hear." Murdoch grinned, and it wasn't a pleasant sight. "A woman who knows her place. We'll have a bottle of your best whiskey and some information." "The whiskey I can provide," Maria Elena replied carefully. "The information depends on what you're asking." Murdoch's smile widened, showing teeth that were too white and too sharp. "Smart girl. I like that. We're looking for a man. Goes by the name of Pablo Gutierrez. About yay high." He held up his hand. "Dark complexion. Rides a paint horse with a white blaze. You seen anyone matching that description? Every soul in that cantina knew Pablo Gutierrez. He was Maria Elena's younger brother, a good kid who worked hard breaking horses for the local ranchers and never caused trouble for anyone. But they also knew that Pablo had been in the wrong place at the wrong time 3 days earlier, when a genuine horse thief had made off with one of Murdoch's own mounts. The real thief, a no-account drifter named Slade Morrison, was probably halfway to California by now, but Murdoch needed someone to blame, and a Mexican boy was as good as anyone. Maria Elena's hand never wavered as she poured whiskey into 4 glasses, but those who knew her well could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. "I haven't seen anyone by that name, Sheriff," she said quietly. "Now that's interesting," Murdoch mused, downing his whiskey in one gulp. "Because I have it on good authority that Pablo Gutierrez is your brother, and I have it on even better authority that he was seen riding through town not 2 hours ago." The silence in the cantina was thick enough to cut with a knife. Maria Elena's knuckles went white as she gripped the edge of the bar, but her voice remained steady. "My brother is an honest man, Sheriff. If you have accusations to make, perhaps you should speak with him directly instead of intimidating his family." One of Murdoch's deputies, a weasel-faced man named Collins, let out a low whistle. "She's got spirit, Sheriff. I'll give her that." "Spirit," Murdoch repeated thoughtfully, his pale eyes never leaving Maria Elena's face. "Yes, I can see that. The question is whether that spirit can be tamed." The threat in his voice was as subtle as a rattlesnake's warning, and just as deadly. Maria Elena took a half-step backward, her hand moving instinctively toward the shotgun she kept beneath the bar. That's when the doors swung open again, and Trouble walked in wearing worn leather boots and a faded blue shirt. Billy Bonney looked like nothing special at first glance. He stood maybe 5'8" in his stockings, with a slight build that made him seem younger than his 19 years. His face was pleasant enough, boyish even, with clear blue eyes and a ready smile that could charm the birds from the trees. But there was something else there, something that made smart men step carefully around him. Maybe it was the way he moved, fluid and watchful like a cat stalking prey. Maybe it was the Colt .45 that rode low on his right hip, the leather of the holster worn smooth from countless draws. Or maybe it was just the reputation that preceded him. Whispers of a young man who could put 6 bullets in a playing card at 20 paces and sleep sound afterward. Billy took in the scene with those sharp blue eyes, noting the tension in Maria Elena's posture, the predatory gleam in Murdoch's gaze, and the way every other man in the cantina was trying to make himself invisible. "Evening, folks," Billy said pleasantly, tipping his hat to Maria Elena. "Mighty fine establishment you've got here, señorita. Mind if I trouble you for a drink?" Murdoch turned slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "Well, if it isn't the famous Billy the Kid. Heard you were in these parts." "News travels fast," Billy replied with that boyish grin. "Though I have to say, Sheriff, your reputation precedes you as well." "Does it now?" Murdoch's voice was like gravel sliding down a mountainside. "And what exactly have you heard?" Billy accepted a glass of whiskey from Maria Elena, their fingers brushing briefly as he took it. For just an instant, something passed between them. A look, a connection, a promise of protection that needed no words. "Oh, the usual," Billy said casually, taking a sip of his drink. "That you're a man who takes his job seriously, that you don't much care for folks who step out of line, that you've got particular opinions about who deserves respect and who doesn't." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Murdoch's deputies shifted nervously, their hands creeping toward their weapons. But Billy just stood there, sipping his whiskey like he was discussing the weather. "Careful, boy," Murdoch growled. "You're walking a thin line." "Am I?" Billy's tone remained conversational, but there was steel underneath now. "Seems to me I'm just making friendly conversation. Though I have to wonder what brings 4 lawmen into a peaceful establishment, bothering honest folks who are just trying to make a living." "That's official business," Collins spoke up, trying to sound tough. Billy's gaze flicked to the deputy, and Collins suddenly found himself wishing he'd kept his mouth shut. There was something in those blue eyes that made a man remember every sin he'd ever committed, and wonder if today was the day he'd be called to account for them. Official business, Billy repeated slowly. Well, that's interesting. See, I was talking to old Tom Mackenzie just this morning, and he mentioned that a horse went missing from Sheriff Murdoch's personal corral. Said the real thief was a fellow named Morrison. Pale skin, red hair, about as Irish as they come. Now, I'm no lawman, but it seems to me like you'd be looking for someone matching that description instead of harassing Mexican families. The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Murdoch's face flushed red, then went pale, his jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. You calling me a liar, kid? I'm just wondering about your investigative methods, Billy replied mildly. Seems like you might be barking up the wrong tree. What happened next was one of those moments that old-timers still argue about when they gather at saloons and swap stories. Some say Murdoch went for his gun first. Others claim Billy's hand was moving before the sheriff even twitched. But everyone agrees on one thing. It was over faster than a lightning strike. Billy's Colt appeared in his hand like magic, the barrel leveled steady at Murdoch's chest before the big man had even cleared leather. The three deputies froze halfway through their own draws, suddenly aware that they were looking death in the face. Now, Sheriff, Billy said quietly, his voice as calm as still water. I think there's been enough excitement for one evening. Why don't you and your boys finish your drinks and head on back to town? I'm sure you've got important sheriff business to attend to. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the soft hiss of the oil lamps and the rapid breathing of very frightened men. Murdoch's pale eyes burned with hatred, but he wasn't stupid enough to test Billy's speed again. This isn't over, kid, Murdoch said finally, his voice thick with rage. No, Billy agreed, never taking his eyes off the sheriff. I don't suppose it is. Murdoch and his deputies backed toward the door, their hands held carefully away from their weapons. But just before he stepped outside, the sheriff turned back to Maria Elena. You might want to consider who you're choosing to associate with, girl, he said, his tone deceptively gentle. A woman in your position. Well, she needs all the friends she can get, and enemies have a way of making life difficult for pretty senoritas who don't know their place. The threat was as clear as day, and everyone in the cantina understood it perfectly. Maria Elena lifted her chin defiantly, but Billy could see the fear in her eyes. I think the lady can choose her own friends, Sheriff, Billy said coldly. And I think you've worn out your welcome here. Murdoch smiled that terrible smile one more time, then stepped out into the night. His deputies followed like whipped dogs, and the sound of their horses' hooves gradually faded into the distance. The cantina slowly came back to life as conversations resumed in hushed tones. But Billy remained at the bar, his drink forgotten as he watched Maria Elena's hands shake slightly while she cleaned up the glasses. You didn't have to do that, she said softly, not meeting his eyes. Seemed like the right thing to do, Billy replied. Man like that, he doesn't deserve to wear a badge. Maria Elena looked up at him then, and Billy felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with the whiskey. He meant what he said, she whispered, about making life difficult. He's not the kind of man who forgets or forgives. Neither am I, Billy said simply. And in that moment, looking into those dark eyes filled with gratitude and fear, and something else that made his heart race, Billy Bonney made a decision that would echo through the years like thunder in the mountains. He was going to make Sheriff Jebediah Murdoch pay for every cruel word, every threatening gesture, every moment of fear he'd caused, not just for Maria Elena, but for every person who'd suffered under the boot of men who thought their badge gave them the right to be bullies and worse. But Billy had no idea, as he stood there in that lamplight cantina with the desert wind whispering through the doors, just how far he'd have to go to balance those scales. He had no idea that before this story was over, he'd be forced to cross lines that most men wouldn't even dare to approach. He had no idea that Sheriff Murdoch's cruelty ran deeper and darker than anyone imagined, or that the reckoning between them would become the stuff of legend, a tale so shocking and brutal that it would be whispered around campfires for generations to come. All Billy knew was that he'd found something worth fighting for in those dark eyes, and that was enough, for now. The trouble, as troubles do, started small, and grew like a wildfire in dry grass. 3 days after the confrontation in the cantina, Pablo Gutierrez disappeared. He'd been breaking a particularly ornery Mustang for the Patterson Ranch when he'd called it a day and headed home just as the sun was setting. The horse made it back to the corral that night, still saddled but riderless, with foam on its flanks and wild terror in its eyes. Search parties went out at dawn, combing the desert and the hills for any sign of the young man. They found his hat caught on a mesquite bush about 2 miles from the ranch, and nearby, the unmistakable tracks of several shod horses alongside Pablo's barefoot Mustang. But they didn't find Pablo. Word reached Maria Elena at her cantina just after noon, brought by an old vaquero named Santos, who'd ridden his horse near to death getting there. Billy was sitting at a corner table, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to work up the courage to ask Maria Elena about the worry lines that had been etched around her eyes for days when Santos burst through the doors. "Señorita Elena!" the old man gasped, his chest heaving. "Your brother, Pablo. He is gone." The cup shattered against the floor as it fell from Billy's suddenly nerveless fingers. Maria Elena went white as fresh snow, one hand going to her throat as if she couldn't breathe. "Gone," she whispered. "What do you mean, gone?" Santos quickly told them what little he knew. The riderless horse, the hat, the tracks that led north toward the Badlands before disappearing into rocky ground that would hide a trail from even the best tracker. "Could be thrown from his horse," Billy said, but his voice lacked conviction. They all knew Pablo Gutierrez could ride anything with 4 legs and a mane. The boy had been practically born in the saddle. "Could be," Santos agreed, but his dark eyes said otherwise. "Or could be someone don't want him talking to nobody about horses that ain't been stolen." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Everyone in Lincoln County knew that Pablo was innocent of any wrongdoing, which meant that his disappearance served only one purpose: to eliminate a potential witness who could clear his own name and point fingers at the real horse thief. Maria Elena sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. When she looked up, her eyes were dry but fierce, with a kind of desperate determination that Billy recognized all too well. He'd seen it in his own mirror often enough. "I have to find him," she said quietly. "No," Billy said, standing up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. "You stay here. I'll find Pablo. He's my brother. And walking out into that desert is exactly what Murdoch wants you to do," Billy interrupted. "Think about it, Elena. Pablo disappears. You go looking for him, and suddenly you're missing too. Convenient for a man who doesn't like being called a liar in public." Maria Elena stared at him for a long moment, and Billy could see her mind working, weighing possibilities and probabilities, with the cold calculation of someone who'd learned early that the world was a dangerous place for the unwary. "You think Murdoch took him," she said. It wasn't a question. "I think Murdoch is the kind of man who solves problems by making them disappear," Billy replied grimly. "And right now, your brother is a problem." Santos nodded slowly. "There are stories," he said quietly, "about men who crossed the sheriff and were never seen again. Drifters, mostly, men without family to ask questions. But also," he glanced at Maria Elena, then away, "also Mexican boys who got on his wrong side." The silence that followed was heavy, with implications none of them wanted to voice. Billy felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, a familiar weight that he'd carried since he was old enough to understand that the world was divided into those who had power and those who suffered under it. "I'll need supplies," he said finally. "Food for 3 days, water for 5. A good tracking horse if you can spare one." "Billy, no." Maria Elena stood up, reaching out to touch his arm. "It's too dangerous. If you're right about Murdoch, if he's willing to kill to keep his secrets, then you're just giving him another target." Billy looked down at her hand on his arm, at the delicate fingers that could handle a rifle or pour whiskey with equal skill, and felt something twist in his gut that had nothing to do with fear for his own safety. "I've been a target my whole life," he said simply. "One more won't make much difference." But even as he said it, Billy knew this was different. This wasn't about survival or reputation or even justice in the abstract sense. This was personal in a way that made his chest tight and his trigger finger itch. This was about the woman standing in front of him with tears threatening to spill from her dark eyes. This was about a young man who'd never heard anyone disappearing into the desert because he had the wrong color skin and the wrong last name. This was about a badge being used as a license for cruelty, and Billy had seen enough of that to last several lifetimes. "I'll find him," Billy promised, his voice soft but carrying the weight of an oath. "Dead or alive, I'll bring Pablo home." What he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that if Pablo Gutierrez was dead, Sheriff Jebediah Murdoch was going to pay a price that would make other men think twice before they decided that a badge gave them the right to play God with other people's lives. Billy Bonney had killed before. He'd killed men who were trying to kill him, men who'd threatened innocent people, men who'd pushed him past the point where words could solve the problem. But he'd never killed out of pure hatred, never let the cold fury that was building in his chest drive him to the kind of justice that civilized folks whispered about in horrified tones. He was about to learn that there were some lines that, once crossed, changed a man forever. But that lesson was still hours away, waiting in the darkness of the high desert, where the only law was the one carved into the grip of a Colt .45. For now, there was only the promise he'd made to a woman with tears in her eyes, and the growing certainty that before this was over, Lincoln County was going to learn exactly what happened when someone pushed Billy the Kid too far. The desert had stories to tell, if you knew how to listen. Billy rode out before dawn, when the world was still painted in shades of gray and purple, and the morning star hung low over the mountains like a diamond on black velvet. He was mounted on a dun-colored mare that Santos had sworn could track a shadow across bare rock, and he carried enough supplies to last a week if he was careful. More importantly, he carried information. The night before, while Maria Elena had tended to customers with the kind of forced normalcy that fooled nobody, Billy had made quiet rounds to every cantina, trading post, and bunkhouse within a 20-mile radius. He'd bought drinks for old-timers and young punchers alike, listening to stories that grew more disturbing with each telling. There was Juan Morales, who'd disappeared 2 months ago after accusing one of Murdoch's deputies of cheating at cards. There was Running Wolf, a half-breed scout who'd vanished after witnessing something he shouldn't have seen near Murdoch's private ranch. There was Sarah McKittrick, a widow who'd complained about the sheriff's visits to her farm and had simply stopped coming to town one day. Too many disappearances. Too many people who'd crossed Murdoch or his men and had simply ceased to exist. But there was something else, too. Something that made Billy's skin crawl when he finally put the pieces together. All of them, every single person who'd vanished, had been what Murdoch would consider undesirable. Mexicans, Indians, women who didn't know their place, men who'd questioned authority. It was like the sheriff was systematically cleaning house, removing anyone who didn't fit his vision of how Lincoln County should be run. And now Pablo Gutierrez had joined that list. The mare picked her way carefully through the rocky terrain where the search parties had lost the trail, her hooves finding purchase on stone that would have sent a lesser horse tumbling. Billy let her have her head, trusting her instincts while he studied the ground for sign that other eyes had missed. He found it 2 hours after sunrise. It wasn't much, a scuff mark on a boulder where a boot heel had scraped, a single horsehair caught on a thorny ocotillo bush, a place where someone had dismounted to relieve himself behind a cluster of rocks. But it was enough to tell Billy that at least 4 riders had passed this way, moving fast and trying to hide their trail. More telling was what he found hidden in a crack in the rocks where someone had carelessly discarded it. A strip of cloth torn from a shirt, blue cotton, the same color as the shirt Pablo had been wearing when he'd left for work 3 days ago. Billy tucked the fabric into his pocket and swung back into the saddle, his jaw set like granite. Pablo had been here, probably tied to his saddle and barely conscious. The question was whether he was still alive, and if so, for how much longer. The trail led north into country that got meaner with every mile. This was Apache territory, or had been before the cavalry had moved most of the tribes onto reservations. Now it was empty land that stretched to the horizon like a brown sea, broken only by mesas and arroyos that could hide an army if a man knew what he was doing. It was also perfect country for making people disappear. Billy had been riding for 3 hours when he smelled the smoke. It was just a whisper on the wind at first, so faint he almost missed it, But the mare's ears pricked forward, and Billy knew she'd caught the scent too. He reined in behind a screen of juniper trees and studied the landscape ahead, looking for the telltale haze that would mark a campfire. There, about 2 miles to the northeast, a thin column of smoke rising from what looked like a box canyon. Too much smoke for a single campfire, and in the wrong place for travelers who were trying to stay hidden. This was the smoke of men who felt safe, who didn't think anyone would be tracking them this far from civilization. Billy ground-tied the mare and pulled his field glasses from his saddlebags, studying the canyon mouth through the wavering heat. He couldn't see much from this distance, but there were definitely horses in there. He could make out movement near what looked like a rope corral. He was about to put the glasses away when something made him freeze. A flash of movement near the smoke, too pale to be an Indian or a Mexican. A big man in a light-colored shirt, moving with the kind of swagger that Billy had learned to recognize from 100 yards away. Sheriff Murdoch was in that canyon. Billy felt the familiar coldness settle into his bones, the same icy calm that had kept him alive through a dozen gunfights. He'd found his quarry. Now came the hard part, getting close enough to see what was really going on without ending up dead or captured himself. He left the mare tied in the juniper grove and worked his way forward on foot, using every scrap of cover the harsh landscape provided. Billy had learned to move like a ghost during his months as a fugitive, and those skills served him well now as he crept from rock to rock, shadow to shadow, until he was close enough to the canyon to hear voices. What he saw when he finally reached a vantage point overlooking the camp made his blood run cold. There were 6 men down there, not counting the prisoners. Billy recognized Murdoch immediately, along with his 3 regular deputies. The other 2 were strangers, hard-faced men with the look of professional killers about them. But it was the prisoners that made Billy's trigger finger start to itch. Pablo Gutierrez was there, all right, tied to a wooden post that had been driven into the ground near the fire. The young man's face was a mass of bruises, his shirt torn and bloody, but he was alive and conscious. Barely. But Pablo wasn't alone. There were 4 others tied to similar posts arranged in a rough circle around the fire, 3 men and a woman, all showing signs of recent beatings. Billy didn't recognize the men, but the woman, Jesus Christ. It was Sarah McKittrick, the widow who'd supposedly left town 2 months ago. She was alive, but she looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past 8 weeks. Her clothes were little more than rags, her hair was matted and filthy, and there were marks on her arms and face that told a story Billy didn't want to think about too closely. This wasn't just murder. This was something far worse. Billy watched in horrified fascination as Murdoch walked slowly around the circle of prisoners, stopping in front of each one to deliver a casual kick or backhand. He was talking the whole time, his voice carrying clearly in the dry air. "Now, the thing you people need to understand," Murdoch was saying conversationally, "is that Lincoln County has certain standards. Standards that don't include thieving greasers, uppity breeds, or women who don't know their place." He stopped in front of Pablo, grabbing the young man's chin and forcing his head up. "Your sister, for instance. Pretty little thing, but she needs to learn some respect. Needs to understand that when a white man shows interest in her, she should be grateful instead of hiding behind kids with guns." Pablo tried to spit in Murdoch's face, but his mouth was too dry. The sheriff laughed and backhanded him casually, splitting the boy's lip open again. "Got spirit, though, I'll give him that. Just like his sister. But spirit can be broken, given enough time and the right kind of motivation." One of the strangers, a thin man with pale eyes and a knife scar running from his ear to his jaw, stepped forward. "How much longer are we going to keep playing with them, Sheriff? This is starting to feel like work." "Patience, Crowley," Murdoch replied. "Good things come to those who wait. Besides, I want to make sure they understand exactly why they're here before we finish up." Billy had heard enough, more than enough. His hand was already moving toward his gun when a voice behind him spoke quietly. "I wouldn't, if I were you." Billy froze, cursing himself for an amateur. He'd been so focused on the scene below that he'd forgotten the first rule of tracking dangerous men. Always assume they've posted sentries. "Turn around slow," the voice continued. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Billy did as he was told, moving with deliberate care. The man facing him was young, maybe 25, with the kind of baby face that made people underestimate him right up until he put a bullet between their eyes. He was holding a Spencer rifle trained on Billy's chest, and his finger was resting easy on the trigger. "Billy the Kid," the sentry said, with what might have been admiration. "I'll be damned. Sheriff said you might show up, but I didn't really believe it. Figured even you weren't crazy enough to track us this far." "Seems like the sheriff knows me better than I thought," Billy replied calmly. His mind was racing, calculating distances and angles, looking for any chance to turn the tables. But the sentry was too far away for a quick draw, and too alert to be caught off guard by clever talk. "Oh, he knows you all right. Been planning for this ever since that night in the cantina. Figured it was just a matter of time before you came sniffing around, trying to play hero for that Mexican girl." The sentry gestured with his rifle toward a narrow path that led down into the canyon. "Start walking. And don't get any ideas about being heroic. The sheriff wants to talk to you before things get unpleasant." Billy started down the path, his mind still working furiously. The sentry stayed well back, professional enough not to get within grabbing distance. But Billy wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. He was halfway down the path when he made his move. It wasn't anything fancy, just a stumble that sent him sprawling behind a boulder, followed by a roll that brought him up with his Colt in his hand. The sentry was good, but he was also young and overconfident. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second, probably wondering if Billy had really tripped or if this was some kind of trick. That hesitation cost him his life. Billy's shot took him high in the chest, spinning him around and sending him tumbling down the rocky slope. The Spencer rifle went off as the man fell, but the bullet went wild, chipping stone near Billy's head. The sound of gunfire echoed through the canyon like thunder, and Billy heard shouts from below as Murdoch and his men reacted to the unexpected noise. There was no time for subtlety now. Whatever was going to happen would have to happen fast and loud. Billy scrambled back up the slope to where the sentry had fallen, snatching up the Spencer rifle and checking the man's pockets for extra ammunition. He found 2 more cartridges and a folding knife that looked sharp enough to shave with. From below came the sound of horses and shouted orders. Murdoch was organizing his men for a search, but they'd have to climb out of the canyon to reach Billy's position, and that would take time. Time Billy intended to use wisely. He worked his way around the rim of the canyon, looking for the best vantage point. What he needed was a position that would give him clear shots at the camp, while making it difficult for return fire to reach him. What he found was better than he'd dared hope. A rock outcrop that overlooked the entire canyon, with good cover and multiple escape routes. Billy settled into position and took careful aim with the Spencer. The range was long for a rifle shot, but not impossible. More importantly, he didn't necessarily need to kill anyone from up here. What he needed was to create enough chaos to give the prisoners a chance. His first shot took one of the strangers, not Crowley, but the other one, in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him diving for cover behind a pile of supplies. His second shot scattered the horses, sending them bucking and plunging around the improvised corral. Murdoch was shouting orders, trying to organize his men for a coordinated response, but Billy's third shot forced the sheriff to dive behind a boulder, cursing like a sailor. That's when Billy made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Instead of continuing to snipe from a distance, instead of trying to pin down Murdoch's men until help arrived, Billy Bonney decided to go down into that canyon and settle this face to face. Maybe it was the sight of Pablo's battered face, or the haunted look in Sarah McKittrick's eyes. Maybe it was the memory of Maria Elena's tears, or just the cold rage that had been building in his chest since the moment he'd realized what kind of monster was hiding behind Murdoch's badge. Whatever the reason, Billy left his position on the rim and started working his way down into the canyon, moving from rock to rock like an Apache warrior. He had the Spencer rifle across his back and his Colt in his hand, and there was a look in his blue eyes that would have made wiser men pack up and leave the territory entirely. Billy the Kid was coming, and he wasn't in a mood to be reasonable. The first deputy he encountered never knew what hit him. Billy came around a boulder like a ghost, and the man barely had time to register the danger before the butt of Billy's Colt cracked against his skull. He dropped without a sound, and Billy helped himself to the man's rifle and ammunition. The second deputy was more alert, or maybe just luckier. He spotted Billy moving between the rocks and got off a shot that came close enough to part Billy's hair. But panic made him rush his next shot, and Billy's return fire took him center mass, dropping him like a sack of grain. That left Murdoch, Crowley, Collins, and the wounded stranger. 4 against 1, in terrain that offered plenty of cover to both sides. Under normal circumstances, Billy would have been smart to withdraw and wait for better odds. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Billy Bonney was well past the point of caring about odds. He was close enough now to hear the prisoners whimpering in fear as bullets flew over their heads, close enough to see the terror in their eyes as they realized that their rescue attempt was turning into a war zone. Close enough to understand that if he didn't end this quickly, innocent people were going to die. Billy took a deep breath, said a quick prayer to whatever God looked after fools and gunfighters, and stepped out into the open. "Murdoch," he called, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "This is between you and me. Let the prisoners go, and we'll settle this like men." The sheriff's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass. "Settle it like men? Boy, you just made the biggest mistake of your short, violent life." Murdoch stepped out from behind his boulder, his gun already in his hand. But he wasn't alone. Crowley and Collins emerged from cover as well, their weapons trained on Billy. 3 guns against 1. Professional killers against a 19-year-old kid who should have been breaking horses or courting girls instead of facing down corrupt lawmen in a box canyon in the middle of nowhere. The smart money would have been on Murdoch. The smart money would have been wrong. What happened next was over so fast that the survivors would spend years arguing about the details. Some claimed Billy drew and fired 3 times before any of his opponents could clear leather. Others swore he was already moving before Murdoch finished speaking, like he could read the future in the sheriff's eyes. All anyone could agree on was the result. Collins never got his gun out of the holster. Billy's first shot took him in the chest, punching through his badge and dropping him where he stood. Crowley was faster, but not fast enough. Billy's second shot caught him in the throat, ending his career as a professional killer in a spray of blood. That left Murdoch. The sheriff was good. Billy had to give him that. His draw was smooth and professional, and his first shot would have killed most men. But Billy wasn't most men, and the bullet that should have taken him through the heart instead grazed his ribs, drawing blood but not slowing him down. Billy's return shot took Murdoch low in the belly, doubling him over but not dropping him. The big man staggered backward, trying to bring his gun up for another shot, but Billy was already moving, closing the distance between them with predatory grace. The wounded stranger chose that moment to try his luck, rising from behind his pile of supplies with a rifle in his hands. But he was hurt and desperate, and his shot went wide. Billy's didn't. Then there was silence, broken only by the sound of gun smoke drifting on the desert wind and Murdoch's labored breathing as he lay bleeding in the dirt. Billy stood over the sheriff, his smoking Colt still in his hand, and felt something dark and cold settle in his chest. This was the moment of truth, the line between justice and vengeance that good men weren't supposed to cross. Murdoch looked up at him with pain-filled eyes, his face gray with shock. You got me, kid," he gasped. "But it won't change nothing. There's others like me, others who know what needs doing." "Maybe," Billy said quietly, "but they'll think twice before they try it in Lincoln County." He should have ended it there. Should have put a final bullet in Murdoch's brain and called it justice. But the sheriff wasn't finished yet. "That Mexican girl of yours," Murdoch wheezed, blood frothing at the corners of his mouth. "When I'm done here, when I heal up, I'm gonna pay her a visit. Gonna show her what happens to women who forget their place. Gonna make her beg before I'm through." Billy went very still, and something in his eyes made even the dying sheriff stop talking. "No," Billy said, his voice as cold as winter wind. "You're not." What Billy the Kid did to Sheriff Jebediah Murdoch in that box canyon would become the stuff of legend and nightmare, whispered about in saloons and around campfires for decades to come. Some said it was justice, pure and simple. Others called it barbarism, a descent into savagery that shamed the very cause it was meant to serve. But everyone who heard the story agreed on one thing. After that day in the canyon, when word spread about what had happened to the sheriff who thought his badge gave him the right to terrorize innocent people, Lincoln County became a much more peaceful place. And in Maria Elena's cantina, where she served drinks to dusty cowboys and tried not to think about the young man with blue eyes who disappeared into the desert and come back changed, folks learned to speak respectfully to strangers and think twice before they decided that might made right, because you never knew when Billy the Kid might be listening. And after what happened to Sheriff Murdoch, nobody wanted to find out what Billy did to men who crossed that particular line. Now, friend, lean in close because what I'm about to tell you ain't for the faint of heart. What Billy Bonney did to Sheriff Murdoch in that canyon has been whispered about in saloons from here to California, and most folks who tell the story get it wrong. Some say it was worse than it was, others say it wasn't near enough. But I was there, hiding behind them rocks with a bullet in my leg, watching it all unfold. See, I was one of them prisoners tied to them posts. Name's Tom Whitfield, though most folks just called me Three-Finger Tom on account of losing 2 digits to a bad rope burn back in '74. I'd crossed Murdoch's path when I'd witnessed one of his deputies stealing cattle from a Mexican rancher, and I'd been fool enough to speak up about it in public. That had earned me 3 weeks in Murdoch's private hell, and I can tell you true. Death would have been a mercy compared to what that man did to folks who got sideways with him. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Billy stood over that dying sheriff like an avenging angel, his face set in stone, and his blue eyes burning with something that went deeper than anger. Murdoch was gut-shot and bleeding out slow, the kind of wound that takes hours to kill a man if he's unlucky enough to be tough. "You want to know something about justice, Sheriff?" Billy said, his voice so quiet you had to strain to hear it. "Real justice ain't about badges or laws or what's written in some book. Real justice is about making sure that men like you understand there's a price for the evil you do." Murdoch tried to laugh, but it came out as more of a gurgle. "You gonna lecture me, boy? You killed more men than I can count." "Maybe," Billy agreed, kneeling down beside the sheriff. "But I never tortured innocent folks for sport. Never used my gun to terrorize women and children. Never hid behind a badge while I played God with other people's lives." That's when Billy did something that surprised all of us. He holstered his Colt and pulled out that folding knife he'd taken from the sentry. The blade caught the sunlight like a sliver of silver fire. "What you gonna do with that, kid?" Murdoch wheezed, but there was fear creeping into his voice now. Billy tested the edge of the blade with his thumb, drawing a thin line of blood. "I'm going to give you a choice, Sheriff. Same kind of choice you gave all these prisoners. Same kind of choice you were planning to give Maria Elena." The way Billy said her name made something cold crawl up my spine. There was love there, sure enough, but there was also a promise of retribution that would have made the devil himself think twice. "See, you got 2 ways this can end," Billy continued conversationally. "Way 1, I put a bullet in your brain right now, quick and clean. Your suffering ends, and you go to whatever judgment awaits a man like you." Murdoch's eyes were fixed on that knife blade like it was a snake getting ready to strike. And way 2? Billy's smile was colder than a winter grave. "Way 2, you live long enough to understand what it feels like to be on the receiving end of your own brand of justice. To know what it's like to be completely helpless while someone with power over you decides your fate." Now, I need to be clear about something here. What Billy the Kid did next wasn't about killing, wasn't even about torture in the way most folks understand it. It was about justice in its purest, most terrible form. The kind of justice that makes a man face the full weight of his sins before he answers for them. Billy started by cutting away Murdoch's gun belt, nice and slow, making sure the sheriff felt every moment of having his power stripped away. Then he cut the man's badge from his shirt, the piece of metal that had given him the authority to terrorize innocent people. "Feels different when you're the one tied up, doesn't it?" Billy asked, using the sheriff's own rope to bind his hands. "When you're the one who can't fight back?" Murdoch was trying to maintain some dignity, but fear was eating at him like acid. You can't do this, kid. I'm a lawman." "Are you?" Billy's voice was mild, almost curious. "Because I've been thinking about that, and I can't figure out what law you've been upholding. Sure ain't the law that says all men are created equal. Sure ain't the law that says a badge is supposed to protect people instead of terrorizing them. Billy had finished tying Murdoch's hands, and now he was working on the man's feet. Professional work, the kind of knots that wouldn't slip no matter how much a man struggled. "Let me tell you what the real law is, Sheriff," Billy continued, his hands never pausing in their work. "The real law is that what goes around comes around. The real law is that a man who lives by causing pain is going to die understanding exactly what that pain feels like." That's when Billy did something that still gives me nightmares when I think about it. He took that knife and started cutting away Murdoch's clothes, piece by piece, until the sheriff was as naked and helpless as any of the prisoners he'd tormented. But here's the thing that separated Billy from the monster he was punishing. He never once drew blood. Never once caused physical harm beyond what was necessary to render Murdoch completely powerless. What he was doing was worse than torture, in a way. He was giving the sheriff a taste of absolute helplessness, the same feeling that every one of his victims had experienced. "Please," Murdoch whispered, and hearing that word come from his lips was like hearing the devil ask for mercy. "Please, kid, just end it." "End it?" Billy's eyebrows rose. "But we're just getting started, Sheriff. See, I figure you owe each of these prisoners an apology. A real apology from the heart. And then you're going to tell me where the bodies are buried." "What bodies?" Billy's face went darker than a thundercloud. "Don't play dumb with me. I know you didn't let all your prisoners go free. I know there are families out there still wondering what happened to their kin. You're going to tell me where they are, so those families can give them proper burials." The silence stretched out like a guitar string about to snap. Murdoch's eyes darted from prisoner to prisoner, and you could practically see him calculating whether he had anything left to bargain with. "And if I don't?" Billy leaned in close enough that his words were meant for Murdoch's ears alone. But the canyon was quiet enough that some of us caught what he said anyway. "If you don't, Sheriff, I'm going to leave you tied to this post the same way you left these innocent folks. Naked, helpless, with the desert sun beating down on you and the buzzards circling overhead. Only difference is, you'll know exactly what's coming. You'll have time to think about every cruel thing you ever did, every life you destroyed, every family you tore apart. And when you finally die of thirst and exposure, it'll be with the knowledge that not one soul in this world will mourn your passing. Now, I need to tell you something about the desert in high summer. It's not just hot. It's like being inside a furnace that somebody keeps stoking. The sun beats down like a hammer, and there ain't no shade worth mentioning. A man tied up naked in country like that, well, it would take days for him to die, and every hour would be pure agony. Murdoch understood this as well as any of us. You could see it in his eyes, the sudden terrible realization that Billy wasn't bluffing, that the kid was prepared to give him exactly the kind of slow, agonizing death that he'd probably given to others. "All right," Murdoch croaked. "All right, I'll tell you. But you got to promise. You got to promise you'll make it quick when I'm done." Billy sat back on his heels, considering. "That depends on what you tell me, and how much of the truth I think it is." So Murdoch talked. Started slow, but once he got going, the words poured out of him like water from a broken dam. He told us about the unmarked graves scattered across Lincoln County. He told us about the bribes and the corruption, about deals made with cattle thieves and horse rustlers in exchange for a cut of the profits. He told us about the women he'd abused and the families he'd terrorized into silence. Most horrible of all, he told us about the game. See, Murdoch and his inner circle had turned cruelty into entertainment. They'd take prisoners out to this canyon and make sport of them, seeing how long they could keep a man alive while they did things that don't bear repeating in civilized company. They kept score, like it was some kind of contest. Sarah McKittrick had been their plaything for 2 months. The 3 men tied to the other posts had been there for weeks, kept barely alive for Murdoch's amusement. And Pablo had been scheduled to be the guest of honor at their next game session. By the time Murdoch finished talking, the sun was getting low in the western sky, painting the canyon walls red as blood. Billy had listened to every word without interruption, his face getting more and more like carved granite. When the sheriff finally fell silent, Billy stood up and walked away from him, going over to where we prisoners were tied. He cut our bonds with quick, efficient strokes of that knife, never taking his eyes off Murdoch. "Can you folks ride?" he asked us. Sarah McKittrick nodded shakily. I think so." "Then gather up what supplies you can carry and get out of here. There's a town called Roswell, about 50 miles southeast. Tell the sheriff there what happened, but don't mention my name unless he asks direct." "What about you?" Pablo asked, rubbing his chafed wrists. "What about him?" He nodded toward Murdoch. Billy looked back at the sheriff, who was watching us with the desperate eyes of a man who knew his time was running out. "I gave him my word I'd make it quick if he told the truth. A man's word means something, even to a snake like him." That's when I spoke up. "Kid, I know you got no reason to listen to an old fool like me, but maybe you should reconsider. What you're fixing to do, it's going to change you, mark you in ways you can't undo." Billy looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in those blue eyes that looked older than his 19 years. "Tom, I appreciate the concern, but I changed the minute I saw what this bastard was doing to innocent people. The minute I realized that someone with a badge could get away with this kind of evil, just because nobody was brave enough or strong enough to stop them." He gestured toward the scattered bodies of Murdoch's men. "This ends here, today. And it ends in a way that sends a message to every other would-be tyrant in the territory. There's a price for treating people like animals, and eventually, someone's going to come calling to collect that debt." I wanted to argue more, but the look in Billy's eyes told me it wouldn't do any good. His mind was made up, and nothing I could say was going to change it. So we gathered what we could carry and started the long trek out of that canyon of horrors. As we reached the rim, I looked back one last time and saw Billy kneeling beside Murdoch, that knife glinting in his hand. I won't tell you exactly what Billy did to that sheriff in his final moments, partly because some of it I couldn't see clear from that distance, and partly because some stories are too dark for telling around a campfire. But I will say this. True to his word, Billy made it quick. One moment, Murdoch was pleading for his life, and the next, he was silent forever. But what Billy took from him before he died, well, that was the part that became legend. The part that got whispered about in saloons and trading posts from Texas to California. The part that made other corrupt lawmen think twice before they decided to abuse their authority. Let's just say that when they found Murdoch's body 3 days later, it was clear that justice had been served in a very specific, very personal way. The kind of justice that left no doubt about what happened to men who preyed on the innocent and the helpless. When Billy finally caught up with us on the trail back to Lincoln County, he was different. Quieter. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A shadow, maybe, or just the weight of what he'd done settling on his shoulders. But when Pablo shook his hand and Sarah McKittrick kissed his cheek in gratitude, when we all thanked him for giving us back our lives and our freedom, I saw something else in those eyes too. Peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you've done what needed doing, even when it cost you something precious in the process. The ride back to town took us 2 days, and during that whole time, Billy barely spoke except to make sure we were all holding up all right. But on the evening of the second day, when we were camped by a little spring in the shadow of some cottonwoods, he finally opened up a bit. "You think I'm damned now, Tom?" he asked quietly, staring into the flames of our small fire. I thought about that for a while before answering. "I think," I said finally, "that there's different kinds of damnation. There's the kind that comes from doing evil for evil's sake, and there's the kind that comes from doing terrible things for good reasons. If you're damned, kid, then so is every man who ever stood up to a bully or protected the weak." Billy nodded slowly. "I keep thinking about what you said back there, about how this would change me. Has it?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Yeah, it has. I used to think there was a clear line between right and wrong, between the good guys and the bad guys. Now I know it's not that simple. Sometimes good men have to do bad things to stop worse things from happening, and sometimes the cost of justice is higher than anyone wants to pay. You regret it?" Billy looked up at me then, and his eyes were clear and steady. "No, I regret that it was necessary. I regret that there are men like Murdoch in the world, but I don't regret stopping him." When we finally made it back to Lincoln County, word of what had happened spread like wildfire. The official story, as reported in the territorial newspapers, was that Sheriff Murdoch and his deputies had been killed in a gunfight with unknown assailants while pursuing horse thieves in the Badlands. The surviving prisoners were found by a search party and returned safely to their families. Billy's name was never mentioned in the official reports, but that didn't matter. In cantinas and bunkhouses, around kitchen tables and church socials, folks knew who had brought justice to Lincoln County. They knew who had put an end to Murdoch's reign of terror, and they knew what had been done to send a message to other men who thought their badges gave them license for cruelty. The effect was immediate and profound. Overnight, Lincoln County became a more peaceful place. Deputies started treating folks with respect instead of fear. The territorial government sent in new lawmen, honest men who understood that a badge was a responsibility, not a privilege. And in Maria Elena's cantina, when Billy finally walked through those doors 3 days after disappearing into the desert, the silence that greeted him was filled with a kind of reverent respect that money can't buy and power can't command. Maria Elena took one look at his face and knew that something fundamental had changed. The boy who had ridden out to find her brother was gone, replaced by a man who had looked evil in the eye and done what needed to be done to stop it. She poured him a drink without being asked, and when their hands touched as she slid the glass across the bar, he felt some of the darkness lift from his shoulders. "Thank you," she said simply. Billy nodded. "Your brother's safe. They all are. I know. Pablo told me what you did. What you sacrificed." Billy took a sip of his whiskey, tasting the burn and finding it good. Sometimes a man has to choose between his soul and his conscience. I chose my conscience. Maria Elena leaned across the bar, close enough that he could smell the scent of her hair, could see the tears gathering in her dark eyes. "And that," she whispered, "is why you still have both. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're wondering if Billy the Kid really did what the stories say he did to Sheriff Murdoch. You're wondering if the legend matches the reality, if the whispered tales of justice served cold in a desert canyon are true, or just the product of too much imagination and too little fact. All I can tell you is this: I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. And while I won't speak to the details of what Billy did in those final moments, I will say that justice was served that day. True justice, the kind that balances scales that the law couldn't touch. Sheriff Jebediah Murdoch got exactly what he deserved. No more, no less. And if that sounds harsh to your civilized ears, if that sounds like frontier justice taken too far, then I ask you this: what would you have done? If it was your sister, or your brother, or your wife tied to those posts? If it was your family that had suffered under the boot of a corrupt lawman who thought his badge made him untouchable, what would you have done? Would you have trusted the law to handle it? Would you have written letters to territorial authorities and hoped for the best? Or would you have done what Billy Bonney did, taken justice into your own hands and made sure that evil got exactly what it had coming? I know what I would have done. And I know what any man worth his salt would have done. Billy the Kid became a legend that day in the canyon, but not for the reasons most folks think. He became a legend because he showed that there are still men in this world willing to pay the price for doing what's right, even when that price is higher than anyone should have to pay. He became a legend because he proved that evil doesn't always win, that bullies don't always get to keep bullying, that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys finish first. And he became a legend because in a world where might too often makes right, where badges and money and power protect the wicked from the consequences of their actions, Billy Bonney stood up and said, "No more." That's the real story of what happened in that canyon. That's the truth behind the whispers and the rumors and the tales that grow taller with each telling. Billy the Kid made Sheriff Murdoch pay for his crimes in full, with interest. And in doing so, he made Lincoln County, and maybe the whole damn territory, a safer place for decent folks to live. The legend lives on because it needs to live on. Because as long as there are men who abuse their authority, who prey on the weak and innocent, who hide behind badges and laws while they terrorize honest people, there needs to be the possibility that someday, somewhere, another Billy Bonney will come calling. And when that day comes, When justice finally catches up with the wicked, the price will be paid in full. That's the promise Billy left behind in that desert canyon. That's the legacy that still echoes through these mountains and valleys, carried on the wind like a warning to those who would follow in Murdoch's footsteps. Do right by folks, or someday you might find yourself face to face with your own reckoning. And trust me, friend, you don't want to find out what that reckoning looks like. The fire's burning low now, and I can see you folks are getting tired. That's good. This ain't the kind of story that should keep you awake all night. But before you turn in, remember this. Legends ain't just stories we tell to pass the time. Sometimes they're warnings, sometimes they're promises, and sometimes, if we're lucky, they're reminders that in this hard world, there are still a few people willing to stand up for what's right, no matter what it costs them. Billy the Kid was one of those people, and Lincoln County was a better place because he rode through it. That's the truth of it, plain and simple. Now get some sleep, and maybe say a prayer for the young man who paid the devil's price to keep decent folks safe. He earned it.